Welcome to the Biochar Show. Today's episode is a foundational conversation for the biochar industry, and one I believe you'll find genuinely useful. Produced by Biochar Today, the Biochar Show explores carbon not just as a problem to be managed, but as a material system engineered for resilience, durability, and scale through conversations with the practitioners, engineers, scientists, market leaders that are advancing biochar into real-world deployment. As biochar has moved from research and pilot projects into commercial markets, one challenge has consistently slowed adoption. That's inconsistent data. Producers, buyers, carbon registries, and laboratories have often worked from different assumptions and testing methods, making it difficult to compare materials, verify claims, or scale with confidence. That changes with the release of the new American National Standard for Biochar. On this episode, we explore what that standard actually does, why it matters now, and how it reshapes trust across the entire biochar value chain. I am your host, John Webster of GoBiochar.com, working at the intersection of biochar supply, consulting, and education to help scale real-world biochar markets across North America. To unpack this moment, I'm joined by three returning guests who sit at the intersection of industry standards and markets. That's Myles Gray from the U.S. Biochar Initiative, Chris Weiberg from Timber Products Inspection, and Annie Nichols from Mangrove Systems. And I'll bring the market perspective from the ground on how this standard turns physical biochar from a promising material into deployable infrastructure across agriculture and other product markets. With that context, let's bring our guests in and get to the conversation. Now that the show introduction is over, let's have our guests introduce themselves. Annie, how about we start with you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Nichols. I am the general manager of Biochar here at Mangrove Systems, where I lead our go-to-market strategy, support on certification, and serve as the overall in-house biochar expert with our mangrove clientele. Prior to this, I worked with Pacific Biochar as their director of operations and carbon management, where I oversaw the compliance and commercialization of over 20,000 credits of biochar. And I hold a Master of Science in Sustainability Management from Columbia University. Happy to be here.
That is fantastic. Annie, thanks for introducing yourself. And then Chris, let's move on to you.
Sure. And thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here today. So Chris Weiberg with Timber Products Inspection Biomass Energy Lab. We're a commercial laboratory testing biochar. In addition, though, I'm also very involved in standards development. I've led a lot of different standardization projects over the years, and very recently, project leader for the American National Standard for Biochar. Also, U.S. Technical Advisory Group Chair to ISO TC 238. So basically involved in all the standardization work that goes along with this industry.
Oh, fantastic. And real quick, I want to remind everybody that we do have an earlier interview episode with Chris where he can talk more about what TPI does and what his responsibilities are. All right, Myles, my friend, it's your turn.
Great. My name is Myles Gray. I'm the Executive Director of U.S. Biochar Initiative. I've been in the biochar space, in and out of the space since 2010, in consulting, academia, industry, and now in the nonprofit sector. Our organization, USBI, we are really focused on developing markets and standards for physical biochar as one of the key unlocks for growing the industry, particularly in the global north. And clearly our focus is on the United States. So happy to be here, John, and looking forward to the topic.
All right, thank you. And in order to personalize this conversation, could you tell, I'd like each of you to just take a quick moment and tell us where you first learned about biochar. Myles, let's go back to you.
Great. So I first learned about biochar in West Virginia in 2007, and this was a mentor of my wife's. My wife had done work on small-scale drinking water systems in rural Honduras, and one of her mentors, a guy named Fred Stottlemyre, led an organization called the International Rural Water Association, and he was using locally produced biochar to remove pesticides from drinking water in small Honduran villages. And it just kind of percolated my mind. And then I ended up moving to Oregon in 2010 to study biochar at Oregon State University. So that was my intro to the biochar space.
Fantastic. Annie, when did you first find out about it?
Yeah, so early in my career, I worked with local and national farmers across the US on sustainability initiatives and was always trying to understand how we can incentivize and pay for the storage of carbon and the stewardship of that land. I learned about carbon markets in grad school in 2019, 2020, and saw an opportunity there, and then finally moved to Oregon in 2020 at the same time as one of the biggest wildfires in the West was going on. I experienced and both breathed in about 1 million acres of smoke living in Bend, Oregon during that year, and quickly learned about the opportunity for biochar combining wildfire mitigation, forest treatments, storage of carbon, as well as improving soil health. And since then, I've really been all in terms of this really cool circular and opportunity to address climate adaptation through biochar.
Oh, fantastic. And Chris, on to you.
Yeah, so thinking back, I'm not sure exactly when I can put a finger on exactly when I learned about it. In '98, I set foot for the first time in a coal laboratory where we also tested solid biofuels and thermally treated solid biofuels, which of course covered a lot of technologies: torrefaction, steam explosion, hydrothermal carbonization, and charring. And we would see all of those products. And so over nearly 30 years. I've seen a lot of different materials, but I don't know that it was specifically called biochar until recently. Within the past 5 to 10 years, I think the most common technology we used in the earlier days was torrefaction. But without a doubt, I would say the referring to products as specifically biochar has kind of been an explosion of that in the past 5-ish years. So
Yeah, it really has been noticeable, and the increase in awareness on the public's really jumped into perspective, and more opportunity as we move into the commercial markets, the carbon credit, the physical biochar market. And now let's get into the deeper conversation around the standards. Myles, I want to ask you to provide a primer for those that might be uninformed as to what the standard is. Let's talk about what the standard name is for clarity. If you can give some context about the scale and the intent behind it, and how USBI is focused on this now and into the future.
Yeah, great. So for those of you who aren't aware, we recently worked with Chris and others to develop a new standard for the analysis of biochar. And that standard is called ANSI/ASABE/USBI S668, Methods for Measurement and Testing of Biochar. And it's developed through the American National Standards Institute with an organization called the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers. That's ASABE. We're really excited about it. It's primarily just focused on testing methods at this point. We'll be advancing additional standards as we move forward. And really, our approach in this related to standards, it's become a major part of what we do at USBI. And part of that is based on industry feedback and interest, which surprisingly to me, when I came into this role at USBI, I've been really surprised to see how much interest there is, and it's really grown on me. And I think there's a couple different reasons for why there's such a need right now. I think one of the key pieces is just the growth in the biochar industry. Since about 2019, biochar projects have really picked up steam, and the amount of biochar being produced in the United States and around the world is growing really rapidly. And with any industry growing rapidly, at some point, there needs to be a standardization effort to make sure that buyers in particular of the physical biochar and also the carbon products, right? It's really related to the buyers being able to guarantee that what they're buying is what they think they're buying. And it also enables, especially on the physical biochar side, which was our organization's focus, it allows a buyer to change sources with confidence. It's one thing to develop a product line around a single biochar material from one biochar producer, but there are always going to be reasons, particularly as the industry grows, that you're going to want to be able to switch biochar producers for your products or for your need. And it really enables that component of the industry to grow and underpins that. And the other reason that the standards are needed right now and why we're pursuing them is that there are existing standards out there for biochar. There are standards that are being developed through ISO. There are standards that have been developed by Carbon Standards International. But the reality of this situation is that none of those standards really work quite right for the US biochar industry. They have all thus far been developed using European analysis methods and European regulations as the baseline. So our goal is really to develop a set of standards that are easy to implement in the United States and elsewhere. That we're not focused exclusively on the United States, but that's our baseline, is making standards that are implementable by US labs and US biochar producers.
That's fantastic. Thanks for giving us the update. And I agree about the whole the concept behind being able to produce or connect with a new provider for your biochar needs. And then also it helps us when we're addressing blends as we have to go to market. And speaking of markets, Annie, can you tell us how the standard is arriving at the right time for what it is you're working on?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'd say it's the right time. If this existed 5 years ago, I think everyone would be very pleased as well. I've been in this industry for about 5 years now, so not nearly as long as Chris and Myles, but over that 5 years, I've seen, we had 2 carbon registries and standards, and we now have 6. So I've witnessed this divergence of standards and requirements of the creation of carbon credits that is creating confusion in the market when it comes to a buyer. So in the same way that Myles is talking about this optionality that physical buyers of biochar want, it exists the exact same for credit buyers, right? They want to know that a ton of CO2 equivalent that they're buying from supplier A is the exact from supplier B. And I think we've lacked that type of standardization for numerous reasons, one of those being these larger protocols that come from the registries. But one of the biggest things we can pinpoint in that comparison is in lab testing. So I did some back of the napkin math before this. Taking a 10,000 ton facility at an 80% carbon content versus 85% carbon content, which if you're testing carbon content in different ways is fully realistic that you could end up with these different percentages. You would actually end up with a little under 2,000 in difference of carbon credits produced because of the quantification of organic carbon, which is the basis of the calculation of how much CO2 you're actually sequestering. That's huge. I mean, when you talk to credit buyers and you're the last person to buy those credits, and these don't exist because you're either over accounting or under accounting what's actually being produced. So if we can standardize how we're doing this testing, we're closing loopholes that allow producers to either overestimate, or we're closing loopholes where producers are underestimating their credits. We can create a much better and financeable market that buyers have a lot more trust and transparency in as well.
Transparency is absolutely key in this point. And I know that Myles had a really strong drive to find a way to standardize everything. And when he met with Chris at one of the North American Biochar Conference events, I think the two of them just hit it off. They had the same ideas. And so, Chris, I want to kind of move over to you. We want to get a little bit deeper into this. So effectively, we can identify that there was some inconsistencies between labs. And so that kind of made it so we understood that this new standard would be unavoidable. And between the work that all of you've done, we've been able to get this out pretty quick. Can you let us know kind of the basics about this? And then let's not be afraid to go a little deeper on that for more of a technical discussion. This really is kind of a keystone moment for the industry, really bringing in the credibility.
Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about what the problem was, and from a laboratory's perspective, let's say a customer came to our laboratory and asked for a volatile matter test, and we report a value, and that person then passes the information along to a buyer. The buyer has a different source of testing. They show conflicting results. The calls start coming in. Why is your number different than their number? And the number of calls that go into trying to explain and who's right and all this back and forth, it's just unbelievably time consuming. And, and that's the problem when laboratories kind of say, well, I'm going to set up, I've kind of got it figured out how I'm set up, but we're not all set up the same. Discrepancies between laboratories create really big issues and it destroys confidence. So whether it's finance, whether it's the willingness to buy or sell a product, if you can't have confidence in your data, it's going to be a showstopper or at least slow down the whole process of building out a model. So it has everything to do with everybody being able to know what are the true values, having consistency between laboratories, and just confidence in your data overall. And so that was one of the problems with the earlier programs. I guess that we had talked in the prior podcast about IBI, and the problem with the IBI standard was very specifically a rather eclectic grab of methodologies coming from different industries, where labs would have to identify how they were going to set up for it. And it was almost impossible for any one lab to set up in a way that they know would be consistent with how another lab would set up. And it's not that anybody did anything wrong. They just did the best with what they had. The solution with the new standard is to get what we've been constantly preaching as methodological alignment, making it so that all methods blend from one into the next, There's a sampling procedure that lends to a sample preparation procedure. Then all of the physical and chemical test methods all kind of take a stepwise approach, one to the next. And if it's all written out well in a standardization format, then each lab in turn can grab those same documents and set up around them and have confidence that we're going to be giving comparable data. So that's the main difference between where this new standard is compared to where we were. And hopefully it provides an opportunity for everybody to just feel better about their projects, more confident about moving forward with projects.
Chris, I have a follow-up question for you on that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the code, the teams that were involved with making this decision? I understand from our previous conversation that this was something that we were able to get through much, much faster than some of the other processes. And then we know that this is going to change the trust, but bringing those labs into compliance with this standard, what's the process for that as well?
Sure. So, with getting it to this point faster, I'll start with that. So, the standards that we ultimately chose, the vast majority of the standards that are included in the American National Standard for Biochar are ISO, coming directly out of ISO Technical Committee 238. There were decisions made over the past couple of years that ISO TC 238 would be not just solid biofuels anymore, but solid biofuels and pyrogenic biocarbon, which includes biochar. What they haven't specifically done is go through their 48 methods and determine, well, are they all perfectly applicable as is, or do they need to be modified or tweaked in some way to be usable? And what we did was to say, let's start this vetting process now with our own technical group, and we can amongst ourselves confirm whether or not they're appropriate or not. And by and large, we do consider them to be appropriate. However, if there were issues with any one of the methods, we could call that out and incorporate it into our technical documents. And so we jumped ahead of ISO. We did over the period of about June of 2024 to June of 2025, we had a large team of experts, around 40 total on the overall committee, not all present on every meeting, but meeting every other week for 2 hours for a year. We were able to go through and vet essentially all of the standards that had any relevance towards biochar. The culmination of that is the S668 standard, which now very specifically lists, if you want to test moisture, here's your method, or at least we recommend this method, and on down the line for all the various test procedures that we vetted. We didn't necessarily vet every last test procedure that could possibly be used for biochar. We wanted to focus on the most relevant, most important, just because it would just take so long to cover everything. So what is in the standard now are the most important methods for this purpose and available in advance of ISO going through and basically doing the same thing. We also got one additional benefit. Once we were done with our vetting, we could forward our work product to ISO so that now as they begin and work on the same initiative that we finished, they already see what our conclusions were and, anticipate that they will land similarly, mainly because I also sit on all the various working groups and processes for ISO. So they were also incorporated while we were writing the standard. So during the vetting process, we did send the product out to ISO for their vetting and review, even before we published the American National Standard. So we already know that our published document will be very well received within ISO. And the whole thing there is, we wrote an American National Standard. Is this just going to be American, North American in particular, or will the rest of the world align with it so that we can also do international commerce, not just within North America? And to a large extent, we have confidence that it will be embraced across the world just simply because of the prior vetting that we did throughout that process.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I do have a question. What was acceptable in the past with the typical testing methodologies that we had for the commonly adopted IBI standard, especially here in North America? So what was acceptable before that no longer is or no longer will be with the new methodology for testing?
I don't necessarily, I think I could lend to certain techniques. Like an example, volatile matter is one of the ones that just comes striking to my mind when you ask that kind of a question. The charcoal method for volatile matter was very imperfect. The new way of doing it uses an oven where it's heated to a specific temperature. You open the door, slide the sample in, close the door, and you hit your timer for 7 minutes and take them right out again afterwards. It's very reproducible. The methods priorly referenced said, well, heat your oven up to that temperature. Now open the door and set that crucible on the edge of the furnace, or on the door, I think it was. And then after it warms up a bit, move it to the lip of the furnace and then eventually slide it in and then close the door and set your timer for 7 minutes. And how reproducible is that compared to the new method? So the bottom line was that was one of our biggest points of contention before. We were very regularly getting, well, this other lab came up with a different volatile content than you guys did. Why is your number right and their number maybe not right? Well, we followed a procedure that was reproducible, and so those are the kinds of things that we've weeded out. And then you can also think of it in terms of what labs have to come up with on their own. Under the IBI technique, there were a few standards coming from the charcoal industry, some from AOAC, some from TMEC, some from solid waste. Every one of them have what they call embedded methods, meaning if I'm going to work with let's say I'm running this test, somewhere in that test, it's going to say, well, you need to prepare the sample, see this other standard for how do you prepare it. If I do that with a charcoal standard, it's going to tell me to prepare it per the charcoal way of preparation. If I'm doing solid waste, it's got a different standard for prep and on down the line. And so I can only really prep it once to run all my analyses. So which one do I choose? The way I prepare it may be different than somebody else. And that was just a choice I had to make in my lab because there's no real way to comply with all of the caveats that were in the prior standard. So those inconsistencies are weeding out what labs have to do to try and figure out how to put a program together. In this case, the whole program is defined, and there's less that a lab has to decide on their own.
That's fantastic. I want to ask Myles a quick question from the USBI perspective. What was the biggest technical misconception that this standard is intended to correct?
I think it's probably related to what Chris just said. My view of why this standard was needed, the primary reason was that the existing standards aren't suitable and easy to use in North America. Going back to that IBI standard, it was extremely well intentioned. It was a great standard and it really served its purpose at the time that it was produced. I think it was originally released in 2015. Before there were any other comparable standards. So it was really valuable, but a lot of what that was it was a research standard in many ways. And it wasn't really intended as a commercial laboratory standard. And so that was the biggest thing we were trying to do was methodological consistency. And back on a point that Chris just made, the standard, this S668 standard, essentially references two analytical frameworks. One is ISO, and that, as Chris said, we're aligning that with another effort underway right now on the international level that will eventually develop a biochar and biocarbon standard. That could be years away. I'm not really sure how quickly that will move, but international standards efforts are much slower. A lot of the methods are ISO methods, and then the other methods are EPA. So anything related to pollutants in this S668 standard has an EPA method. And that's just fundamentally required for using a product like biochar in the United States. Every state regulation related to soil amendment or any other hazardous compound is relaying back to EPA methods. So there's no real way to get around that here in the United States. So that's what we ended up with, was a standard with two frameworks, ISO for most things and EPA methods for pollutants. I would say that was really the fundamental piece. And beyond simplifying the methods, we think that will increase the number of labs that are able to use this standard. Because the IBI standards were pretty challenging, and there was only a small handful of labs that would use those methods. So that was the main goal.
Yeah. Annie, I think I want to move over to you and talk about market perspective and how this standard strengthens MRV and credibility.
Yeah, thanks, John. If it's okay, I'd love to go back to that question you just asked, honestly, because I think there's, as Myles and Chris are talking about it, I have a different perspective from the carbon crediting, which is IBI was certainly, I think, the first and a basis for the first Puro standard. But we also had the European Biochar Certificate from CSI, which was the basis for CSI's crediting standard. And they since produced the World Biochar Certificate, WBC, that is still used by Puro and Isometric and others. So it's not just the ISO. IBI turned into the WBC. I think IBI handed it over to CSI. And in the WBC, this is something we've talked about for a long time, they're using DIN standards. They're not using ISO. They're using a German standard that really only German labs are going to get accredited to most times. And so you now have this environment of you're using different standards across ISO and DIN. Different labs are doing it in different ways. One particular example, so the WBC has material standards as that as well, that they're using their DIN or their WBC testing for. That just doesn't match with the EPA or US standards. So for instance, PAH testing with toluene extraction versus not, you're going to have a more, precise reading with that toluene extraction, which leads to the material standard then not matching to how we would test it in the US. And this really comes out in pragmatic ways with developers. If you've ever been a developer and you've sent a lab sample to Eurofins Umwelt in Germany, and you're waiting to deliver credits, and your lab sample gets stuck in customs, I cannot tell you the panic on your face when you're sitting there for 2 weeks, 2 months, waiting for that lab sample to go through customs just to get tested, not even talking about the added expense of needing to send it to Germany or to the carbon emissions associated with that. So by being, and I spent many years talking to US labs, seeing if they would get accredited to WBC standards, and it was just always a no-go. So I think it's really pertinent for carbon credit standards. We're testing a lot more frequently. Once upon a time, it was testing every twice a year. Standards now are asking for monthly or multi-test per month. It's just not practical to send those overseas. And so by USBI and Timber Products Inspection creating the baseline to enable labs to pop up in the US that can do this, that are in line with hopefully in the future material standards that we'll have from this process as well. I think that's really, really critical.
So how do you feel about this in terms of the credits market?
Yeah.
It's one of our primary finance mechanisms to get this industry moving forward.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the concept of MRV, measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. This is the basis for how credits get verified. So data collection, understanding your data, it's a very large package. So what we do at Mangrove is we basically digitize this process. You'll see DMRV often, which is the automation and how we streamline the process of producing credits and the data required for verification and issuance. And MRV is what creates credibility in your credits. So the data that's collecting, lab tests are one piece of that. There's, of course, production methods, emissions associated, feedstock sourcing, biochar end use. Like there's this massive data package that's required to it. But the basis of that quantification and that modeling is your carbon content and really your hydrogen to organic carbon content when it comes to permanence testing. So as I said in a previous remark, you can have a 5% difference in your organic carbon content can have a material difference in the number of credits you produce. So if we can standardize this process of MRV, by not using different or by being able to use different labs, but not using different methods and not having different interpretations of that same material, what this leads to is credibility of the lab results themselves, but also the outcomes of the credits produced so that buyers, financiers, people that are want to invest in these markets and purchase these credits have confidence that they're buying the same thing, whether it's coming from different suppliers.
Yeah, and that confidence is absolutely key to industry growth and the investment that we're looking to drive in here. Myles, I have a quick question around the frequency of testing that Annie had mentioned. Currently, does USBI feel like there are any guidelines in terms of how frequently our producers should be testing? And if so, kind of let us know what you have in mind.
With respect to carbon credits, I think it's probably a different story than physical biochar. And as I said at the beginning, our organization, we're really focused on that physical biochar side, sort of who's going to use biochar for what end uses. And in that context, to me, the most important thing is that you're testing different batches and different types of biochar. From that perspective, if you're using the same feedstock and the same process all year long, I'm not sure you need to do a whole lot of different tests in terms of certainty and guaranteeing that the physical product is the same. But clearly, we would want any producer to get a new test anytime they change their process for feedstock.
Yeah, absolutely. From the brokerage or the bulk biochar supply side, which is what I'm focused on, there are producers that will try and give me their latest IBI test or lab test from several years ago, like 3 and 4 years ago, even.
Yeah, so this is something that we intend to address. Actually, one of our next standards that we're going to be working on, standards has become a big part of what we do. And one of the next standards that we're going to be launching, we'll hopefully get it up and running by the end of Q1 2026, is essentially a data reporting and availability standard. And what that standard will do, essentially, the goals of that are twofold. One is to standardize what a biochar analysis report looks like. So in terms of like the PDF and the Excel spreadsheets that you get, it would require both a PDF and an Excel spreadsheet. But the idea there is to standardize what those look like. It seems like a small thing, but right now, if you get a biochar analysis report from 5 different biochar suppliers, they might have used 5 different labs and they're going to have 5 different formats. And sometimes the data will actually be reported in different ways. Some might be reported on an as received basis, others might be received on a dry weight basis. So the goal is to make it so that you can compare between different samples extremely easily from different labs and different suppliers. And it could also likely feed into some of the DMRV components that you're working on, Annie, is like making sure that that's a standardized format, particularly on the Excel or CSV side of those data deliverables. So that is something that we'll be trying to address starting in Q1, and hopefully we'll have that done by the end, or we're hoping to have all of that done by mid-2027.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I do have a question about the Biochar Atlas project. I know USBA is deeply vested in that entire program. What do you see any changes coming to the Biochar Atlas as a result of this new standard?
Well, we'll be requesting that biochar producers provide their data on their biochar in according to this S668 standard. We'll still be accepting, I think, legacy data reports, but I think we're hoping that this new S668 standard really leads to more labs following this standard rather than the older IBI standards. That's probably the biggest change that this might have on that project.
Okay. So I have a follow-up question for the group on this, particularly Myles and Chris. When do you expect this to roll into the labs that are currently available to the market for producers?
Well, I can speak for our own lab. We're already there, and this is what we are accredited to and have always been testing to. So all these standards that are already published in the USBI S668, we're already providing it to that format and fully accredited. There are other labs globally, that I know when we do our validation round robin studies for these same test methods, there's usually around 30 different participants. And so there's lots of labs globally that have these accreditations. It's not just one lab somewhere that you have to send samples to. So in time, no doubt more labs will gain their certifications and set up, but there should already be global options.
Yeah, and one other piece to that is on the technical committee that led the development of this standard, there were at least 4 labs, and I think maybe 5. So TPI with Chris. There were representatives also from control labs, from A&L and ALS, as well as folks from Eurofins. So there were 5 laboratories, at least. There might have been one more than that too. So those 5, were already part of this process. We're hoping they'll start, offering this analysis package. Beyond that, we're going to be working as an organization to roll this out a little bit more intentionally, but I'm sort of holding off on that until we hire our new director of standards, which will be announced sometime in the next month or so, I hope.
Oh, that's fantastic. I know we've spoken in the past about the Interpreting Biochar Labs that was created in part with Kristen Tripp and others. Is there an intent to get that updated in the next year?
Yeah, there will be. I mean, that'll coincide with a lot of different efforts that we have underway at USBI. And that might be part of what our new director of standards works on too.
That's fantastic. Yeah, getting back to a position of trust and building the markets based on that trust, including things like what Annie specializes in terms of MRV. I know that the buyer market is getting a lot more sophisticated. I am consistently asked for different types of feedstock, different types of processes, logistics, how do they handle logistics, the delivery mechanism, sacks and bulk. But as those buyers get more sophisticated, they are also looking into blending. So being able to trust the different types of blends, the different types of opportunities and the processing, having these labs will be fantastic. And again, from a brokerage standpoint, most of us do not want to deal with any labs that are less than 12 months old. And if it's something where the producer can get us even monthly reports, that'd be fantastic. Again, transparency and trust in markets is going to be a big deal in moving the physical biochar to buyers, product producers, and so that gives us the two sides, because one is we have the carbon credits that are driving things. They always talk about the credits. They don't ever discuss the fact that we have to move that biochar and put it in soil or sequester it in order for those credits to be issued. So, Annie, I think I have a question about that's somewhat related, is how are the buyers looking into both the credits, and then is there any consideration by those credit buyers as to how it has been sequestered, where, and lastly on that thread, are they finding themselves getting involved in creating the offtake markets for the physical material?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, to your earlier point, I'd push back that we don't talk about end use, because I think most financiers and buyers, if you talk to them, it's probably one of their biggest liabilities to projects. Because if you start to create incentives for combustion, for metallurgy, there is an opportunity where those credits are no longer permanent. There's an incentive where you could double count. So it actually, if you're telling a story that doesn't have end use included in it, you can almost never sell your credits. You certainly can't get them verified. And it's a big issue for developers. I mean, I've seen it firsthand. We had credit offtakes that were ready to go. They needed to be delivered by the end of the year, but we couldn't get the credits issued because we didn't have soil for it to go into. So it is a really big liability for developers in the carbon market. And I say it's one of the biggest concerns we run into. In terms of what buyers are asking for. I mean, the amount of due diligence projects go through, we typically think, oh, you've gone through certification, you had a certified credit, you're done, you can sell. It's a transactable commodity. It's really not the case. Every single deal that goes through right now is so bespoke. The terms of the offtake contracts are different, and the amount of due diligence that goes into it is extensive. I've been the author of a 100-page due diligence package. If anyone has gone through Microsoft's due diligence, they really have some PTSD. We call it PTSD in my world, because there's just so much that goes into it. And I think it's fair. Like, I think it's the carbon markets have been around for a long time. We've seen a lot of fraud go through this process. People have taken advantage of the system, of buyers, of financiers, and frankly profited off of not doing what they're saying they're doing. So I'm all for the rigor that we've added, but it does create a new threshold that needs to be met. And again, that comes back to transparency, traceability. So to your question, yes, end uses are incredibly important of where it's going, the traceability. So how are we ensuring that it's actually being applied? When you talk about, this gets a little theoretical, but I'm going to share it because I think it's important. If you talk about other CDR methods, carbon dioxide removal methods, it's never the case that the credit buyer is subsidizing their credits through the off-taker or the end user of that material, right? You look at BECCS, you look at, bioenergy CCS, you look at direct air capture, you look at enhanced rock weathering. The buyer of that credit is always purchasing the production of that carbon sequestration and also the carbon sequestration, right? Biochar is the only CDR where we actually require the buyer of the biochar to subsidize the credit for that producer, because the sequestration doesn't exist without the farmer or the concrete user, right? And so I think, what I would put out to buyers is that, like, if you want a high quality credit that has no potential of risk of reversal, you should be thinking about how you can actually pay for the sequestration and application of that material rather than expecting a third party entity like a farmer to actually subsidize that credit cost for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess from a kind of simplify this, what kind of messaging do you think we should be sending to the consumer of both the credits and the physical material?
I'd love to see more insetting. So we talk about offsetting a lot. What insetting is that the person who's actually using the biochar gets to make the claim around the sequestration. I think we're starting to talk about that. We've talked about it in the wine industry in the past. We see it in PepsiCo. But frankly, it gets into some of the mechanics of offsetting and decarbonization. Industries like financial markets, like a JP Morgan credit buyer or a Microsoft, a tech buyer, they have fewer ways to decarbonize their value chain versus an agricultural producer like a PepsiCo, where there's a lot of regenerative agriculture practices they can take that are frankly lower cost than purchasing a carbon removal credit on the market. But I think there are opportunities. There's such a amazing place of like circular economy that can be employed here, where you're using agricultural residues. Why are we selling and decoupling the claim of carbon sequestration from that actual material when it could go back into improving the crop, improving the concrete? So I think that's the conversation we should be having, is how do we keep the crediting claim with the user of the biochar to increase the value and the sustainability claims of the parent company that's actually doing the biochar use?
I couldn't agree more. That is a broad sentiment as well. I guess I have a question related to the standard and avoiding greenwashing concerns. Do you think the standard will drive the practice of retiring the credits in a quicker timeline?
In terms of retirement, maybe you mean issuance, like you could report more quickly?
Credits tend to be traded. I know that a lot of credits that I'm hearing about are traded on the market and then they're not ultimately retired. I've talked to some producers where the buyer of the credit says, I want on my behalf, I just want you to go ahead and retire them now. And you do it, you do the paperwork. Others they have to go through the process to transfer them into their asset holding. And then sometimes you don't hear about when those credits are retired. And so I was just wondering if the increased trust will encourage more of the retirement rather than holding on to it as an asset.
I see. I think people hold on to assets because they think they're going to improve in cost. And so it may be the opposite. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. If you have an asset that people are holding and not retiring because they think they'll have a better return in the future, I don't, it really doesn't have an impact on the producer. They've already sold it to whoever this trader or broker is. So I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. If they're seeing value, I think that's actually a good thing in the market that credit values are increasing, and these people with their quants and models see that. And it doesn't really have, and so if anything, I would think it would create a more transactable asset because you have more trust and transparency into the value of the credit and the certainty that it's doing what it says it's doing.
Yeah. I guess what I would like to do is I'd like to move into what are the next phases of the standards development, kind of what's on the near term horizon in the next 1 to 2 years, and then also into the 3 to 5 years. Myles, is that something you'd like to speak to?
Sure. Yeah. Well, for USBI's part, we are probably doubling or tripling down on standards development. As I said, we'll have a new director of standards coming on board here in the next month or so. And that person will be leading a couple different efforts. I already spoke to the data availability and reporting standards. So that will be one. We'll also be leading a standard, essentially a do no harm end use standard for biochar. So that'll be focused on end uses. It will include thresholds and ranges for specific biochar material properties in specific common biochar markets. It'll be focused on those end uses that a buyer would consider what they're buying to be biochar. And what I mean by that is it's not going to address things like biocarbon. It's not going to address the carbon black industry. It'll address those markets where people think they're buying, call the product they're purchasing biochar. So it'll be mostly focused on agriculture, things like remediation, stormwater treatment, and concrete. So that's two standards that we'll be developing, and we'll be running those both through the ANSI process with ASABE. We're also supporting a couple other standards that are in the works right now through ASTM. One of them is an ASTM standard for biochar and concrete, and that's a project that's being led by Dr. Lori Tunstall at the Colorado School of Mines and a couple other biochar companies. That's really critical because if you want to use anything in concrete, engineers in the United States use ASTM for essentially everything they do. So if you want to use biochar and concrete on a large scale, there has to be an ASTM standard for it, and we'll be supporting that effort. We're also looking into whether we need to do something similar in the filtration space, and we're having some initial conversations there around whether or not we need to develop standards through ASTM for filtration. Now, both of those standards can reference ANSI standards, or an ASTM standard can reference an ANSI standard and can use ISO analysis methods. We might include multiple methods in those, but we don't feel like there's any wasted effort here. It's just that ASTM is what engineers look to. So that's what we're going to be working on initially. There's a couple other things too, but those are the main focus areas for us in the next year or so on standards.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I think one question that is immediately coming to mind is the Code 336 standard, the NRCS Conservation Practice Standard, Code 336. Are they going to adopt the results from the new lab testing?
Yeah, we've been in communication with folks at NRCS who manage that standard, and that standard is up for renewal this year, and we'll be heavily engaged in supplying comments regarding that standard. We've already been in contact with folks at NRCS about this new standard, so we are pretty confident that the updated version of NRCS 336, when it's released, will reference this ANSI standard, the S668 standard.
That's fantastic. These cost share programs absolutely rely on consistency and trust. Earlier, Chris had mentioned North America and in reference to this standard protocol. Do you have any buy-in at this time with Canada and Mexico and even IBI?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so they were all on the committee. So we had multiple Canadian representatives, multiple Mexican representatives, IBI representation. We cast a wide net. We even invited Eurofins. So we wanted everybody to participate in the process, and so we anticipate it'll be well accepted. Just in the rollout since the publication. We have people coming asking for isometric compliance testing, and so we've had to already talk with isometric and talk them through these new methods, which initially weren't written into the isometric protocols, now are referenced in the isometric protocols. Similar for Puro, they're similar conversations. They're very well aware of the projects, and we're already using the methodologies in Puro-based projects. So that's all underway. In time, I'd anticipate all standards become updated, directly referencing the American National Standard or just the ISO testing methodologies that are the foundation of the S668 standard. To broaden this a little bit more, the what's next, for me, it's very specifically working with the international community to follow suit to what we've already done. We had our annual plenary meeting for ISO TC 238 in October. It was in Japan. And they gave me the opportunity to present our standard and all of the things that we found during our process that gave in any way indications that some of these test methods need to be vetted and updated. Now, beginning in 2026, there is a mad rush to get all the working groups moving on everything. And even literally, we're only a couple weeks into the new year. I've already had 4 working group meetings through ISO TC 238 to work on these exact things. And you say, well, on what exactly? And all I can say is everything. An example is something as simple as the word biochar. How is that internationally defined and recognized? And certainly within our group, we can very confidently say biochar is a highly carbonaceous material that's used for sequestration or environmental benefit of some kind, but it's not consumed. That's not a global perspective. There may be people globally that hold that same perspective, but not all countries or industry groups. We have some steel manufacturing entities very regularly using the term biochar, and we know they're going to consume it, right? So it's so getting standardization, even in simple forms like terminology, is in motion. And so 2 of the meetings I've had since the new year are part of Working Group 1, which is the terminology standard. So we're working on all fronts to try and align the international work projects to follow suit with what we've already established. So we so far do not see any major differences or roadblocks. We've seen very wide acceptance of the work we've already done, but you got to be at the table ongoing throughout all these different working group meetings to keep reminding people of what was already found and discovered and get them incorporated in writing into the standards. So that is my charge now for years to come. It'll take 2, 3, 4, 5 years before they're all finally published with the I's dotted and the T's crossed and the cross-referenced the way we want them to land.
Thank you for being such a champion on this cause. I guess, is there anything that we've missed talking about related to the new lab standard?
I could chime in on the future in terms of what this looks for carbon crediting, because I think this is an important differentiation between, what we've done here and what TPI and USBI have done is really the basis in terms of standardizing the testing, right? But there's still a lot of confusion around what are the thresholds that are allowed to be used. So we're talking about isometric and Puro incorporating these new standards into lab testing standards into their methodology. But we are still missing a material standard that uses these lab standards in order to assess the quality. So if you look at Puro, you still have this mismatch of they're using WBC agro or WBC material, but they're using different lab standards. Like if a US producer using this new USBI lab standard is then comparing their thresholds to the WBC agro material standard, you're still going to have that mismatch in terms of thresholds. And so to me, like, what's next step here? And I will say there's WBC Agro, there's also comparison to local limitations and local law. And of course, the EPA and USDA and state law in the US are going to have different thresholds than WBC and everyone else. And so I think that's the big task here is for USBI. So it's really encouraging to hear Myles say that that's the next step, because I think that crediting standards are looking for clarity, but they don't have it, especially when they're looking to credit globally. And these types of standards, it's very hard to build, right? Because different global standards exist. But I think that's the next step. We have to match the lab testing with threshold and material testing to get, again, to improve that standardization.
Yeah, fantastic. Either of you have, either Myles or Chris have anything to add to that?
No, other than that, I often find myself feeling like a character in Harry Potter. Percy Weasley, if anybody's a Harry Potter fan. One of my favorite lines in the entire set of books, which my kids continue to listen to regularly, he talks about developing standards for cauldron bottoms. It's really great. So I often see myself as, and you too, Chris, we're the Percy Weasleys of the biochar world, working away to standardize biochar between uses.
Doing the good work. We appreciate you in the carbon crediting side for sure.
Absolutely. I never expected to hear a Harry Potter reference in any of these episodes. It's fantastic. I'll have a couple of questions that I'll ask, kind of quick round robin as we begin to wrap this up. So this is to each of you. So in one sentence, what fundamentally changes because of this standard now existing? Annie, I'll go to you.
Yeah, well, I think, by standardizing how biochar is tested, the standard removes uncertainty that has limited buyer confidence and investment. And it hopefully turns biochar from a niche solution to a really scalable, financeable climate asset.
Chris, I'm going to bounce to you.
Yeah. So for me, what I'm hoping is by publishing the standard and getting people to understand it, I don't have to lead off every client conversation with an explanation of what the standards are, why they're suited for the purpose, and that they are what we should be using to move forward. You can't imagine how much time it takes to reconvince each person individually each time a new client might call and say, "Hey, I hear you do biochar testing." I would love to get to that point where everybody understands it and they just say, "Hey, I hear you tested the new standard." Yep. And we can move on. That to me is going to be worth its weight in gold, just to get to the part where we can start testing to the new standard and everybody knows what it is.
Yeah. All right, Myles.
The thing that I'm most interested in this whole process was making it so more U.S. laboratories can provide analysis services to really let the market operate and hopefully increase the quality of laboratory analysis services, decrease the hold time and wait time, and ideally translate into cost savings over time. We want more labs doing this service for the biochar industry, which we think the sector is going to grow, and we need more labs doing this work to go along with that. So we're hoping that more labs like TPI get on board with this and start offering those kind of services.
Fantastic. I think this last question around Robin is how close do we feel to that biochar is going to become a commodity that's assisted because of this standard?
Yeah, commodity is a tough word because, even in the wood pellet industry, we're not fully commoditized. The reason I say that is because the end user ends up having certain requirements. And I have a sense that as these materials are used, it's not always going to have to fit the same criteria. There will be different purposes and end uses. So commoditization isn't so much the end reality. It's the idea that when a specification is determined for a specific purpose, it allows each entity to engineer their products to that end goal. And not all biochars are going to be, for example, interchangeable, and we shouldn't expect them to be. The better scenario is each entity that needs and intends to use biochar can say, "Here's what I need out of my biochar," and then entities can work towards those goals for individual companies. But I don't think commoditization is the end goal. It never was in the wood pellet sector.
I was just going to say, I'd agree that in particular on credits, I think we're far from commoditization, and I don't know if we want it. I think buyers, they're not buying credits simply for offset. There's always a story behind the credits. And so one TCO2e from one supplier is never going to be the next. And I think what's so special about biochar is that it has a lot of personality. Like the story behind what you're producing, whether it's feedstock and waste mitigation or wildfire fuel, like I've been interested in, or agriculture versus where it's going, like the co-benefits that we can speak to for every biochar credit coming out of every different project is so different. And I think buyers react to that and they don't want to pay, all right, every time I buy a credit, it's $150 and I know I'm getting the exact same thing. Like there's just too much intricacies and nuances to every single biochar project and credit that I don't think we want to lose that story by the commoditization of a credit through biochar.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Again, I honor your time. I really appreciate the conversation today. I would like to go around the room, have everybody tell us, how does somebody find you? How does somebody find your organization? And so if you can let us know, we will also be including this in the show notes when this is published. Annie, let's start with you.
Yeah, so you can reach me at annie@mangrovesystems.com. We have a contact us form at Mangrove Systems website as well. I'm also the author of the Ask Annie column on Biochar Today. So if you ever have a question, want to talk about carbon certification, been doing it for a long time and would love to answer your question. So there's a contact question form on the Biochar Today website as well that you can reach me and ask all of your nerdy carbon crediting questions as well.
Awesome. Chris?
Sure. Yeah. So again, Chris Weiberg, Timber Products Inspection, Biomass Energy Lab. These two names are the same laboratory. Biomass Energy Lab is essentially our international entity. So for export shipments and any international work, we operate under Biomass Energy Lab. But it is ultimately the same laboratory in the same building with the same people performing analyses. And so we do have a Biomass Energy Lab website. We have a TP inspection website. You can find more about our laboratory. There's even a video, a 5-minute video of our lab. You can see the inside of the lab if you go to the laboratory services portion of our TP inspection website. You can also find me directly on LinkedIn, just Chris Weiberg. Search me, you'll find me. And, more than happy to answer questions and it's a pretty nonstop part anyway, but I invite more. So.
Yeah. Wonderful. Myles?
Yeah, our organization, USBI, we are at www.biochar.org. You can use our contact us form. You can also sometimes find me on LinkedIn if you ping me on there. Sometimes I'll respond quickly, sometimes less quickly. And I'm also at Myles at biochar-us.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I've noticed a decided uptick in the social media presence by USBI. So thank you for that. That's fantastic. So again, everybody, thank you for coming. I really appreciate this conversation. I appreciate your time. And all right, let's all say goodbye to everybody. Thank you.
For having
Thanks
us.
for
Thank
coming.
you.
All right. That was a fantastic conversation. This Biochar Roundtable has been a foundational conversation. What we heard today is that the American National Standard for Biochar is not an endpoint, it is the starting line. It is the technical foundation that allows this industry to scale with confidence. For producers, it creates clarity and market access. For labs, alignment and consistency. For carbon markets and buyers, stronger MRV and lower risk. And for those moving physical biochar into agriculture and other products, it marks the transition from niche adoption to scalable deployment. Standards do not slow innovation, they enable it. I want to thank Myles Gray, Chris Weiberg, and Annie Nichols for their leadership and for sharing their insights so openly. Thank you to Biochar Today for producing the Biochar Show podcast. If this episode was useful, please share it. You can find the Biochar Show on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify, as well as all major streaming platforms. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date. For show notes and resources, visit Biochar Today. Learn about my work in biochar supply, consulting, and education by visiting gobiochar.com. I'm John Webster. This is the Biochar Show.